Welcome to the fourth module of the SLP's ABC series. This program is entitled Becoming Storytelling Animals, Narrative Interventions. The program will focus on how our brains are designed to organize the world into narrative structures, the multiple long-term consequences when students are not good at narrative discourse, and the interventions we can use to improve narrative abilities across the age span from preschool through high school. I hope you enjoy the program and get some great ideas from the information and the videos shown within the program. After this module, you will be able to understand that narrative structure is as basic as syntax for a language user, the critical role of SLPs in reaching our speech and language goals using written narrative as a medium, using narrative reading as an intervention context, using narrative writing as an intervention context, write IEP goals using narrative as the basic level, the new view of narratives. We all know that as SLPs, we have long worked on narratives. Many ASHA studies have focused on narratives, and we found that nearly every child with a language disability is going to have problems with narratives. So we've looked at narratives for assessment and intervention with speech sound disorders, late talkers, children with language disabilities, adolescents and literacy, bilingual children, and learning disabled children, and children with autism. And we have found that all of those populations have difficulty with narratives. Narrative has been viewed as just one of the many language needs of these children. And I've been guilty of this, thinking that I had to work on narrative as one of my skill levels. A book by Jonathan Gottschall recently has influenced me a lot, called The Storytelling Animal, How Stories Make Us Human. And he basically talks about how narrative is just basic to the human, just like walking, talking, syntax, that it's part of our genetic endowment. So he argues that from early childhood, the human mind craves stories, that we display our knowledge of stories from early play, that we tell ourselves stories all day long about who we are and how we feel about ourselves. So he talks about how even young children think of themselves as superheroes and super dancers. And basically you convince yourself that you're the fastest runner or the best dancer, even when other people beat you in the race. Next time they won't. He goes on about how our brain is just naturally tuned in and fascinated with books and movies and now video games, where you can actually become the actor in your own narrative on these video games, and you can battle other people and win the war, to the point that some people have a more vivid narrative life in their video games than they do in their actual life. We use narratives all the time when we recount events throughout the day, and the people who are better at it are more popular. We know that children with language disorders are not good at narratives, and we also know that they are not selected very often to be the most popular kids in the class. We know that narratives have been used to convince people and to teach people lessons. So the Bible is one of the most powerful stories ever written, and To Kill a Mockingbird changed a lot of the ideas in our culture. Much research has shown that narrative ability predicts school success, especially reading comprehension. Narrative structure is just incredibly useful as we go through our days. It helps us to remember the past, plan for the future, organize our daily and long-term schedules. Again, a skill that's very important in order to succeed in school or in the workforce. You have to be able to say, I've got a project due in 2 weeks, and so here's my plan for getting this done. Here are the steps I need to take to accomplish this goal. And yet most people with disabilities have a lot of difficulty with this kind of narrative organization, planning projects, and recording our stories in written language. So, in general, those whose stories have good narrative structure, so we understand that we have to orient the listeners in time. We have to talk about the important characters, the setting, identify a problem, a plan to solve the problem. Then you actually attempt your plan. You either have a good outcome or a bad outcome. Then you sit back and reflect and evaluate. People who can do this automatically are going to have better social development, are going to have better cognitive development, are going to do better in school, and are going to do better in the workforce. Stories help us displace our thinking from factual here and now into the imaginative possibility, the world of possibilities. So, interestingly, it also helps us to emotionally invest and to learn how to deal with emotional issues. So, we have Jack and the Beanstalk, and we've got this scary giant. And when children hear or read or watch that movie, they basically feel frightened and they feel endangered and they feel like they have to come up with a plan and to escape, etc. So we do that throughout our life. You're watching a television show or a movie, and you even know what's going to happen, and yet you feel the excitement, or you feel the stress, or you feel the fear, etc. So Apollo 13 was a good example of a movie where everybody knew what the outcome was, and yet it was, smash hit at the box office because it made you feel the danger, it made you feel the anxiety for the astronauts all the way through the movie. From infancy, the sequence of experiences and the emotional responses are things that we start to code into language, and so they become verbal narratives. So one afternoon, the baby and his daddy were playing in the playroom. Problem was trying to figure out which hole the shape went into. Plan was to put the square into the hole on the shape sorter. So the child's attempting it. The outcome was, uh-oh, it doesn't fit. It's not a square. So bad outcome. And the evaluation, you need to try again. So we engage in narratives every day of our lives from the moment of birth on through. Feeling the emotions of characters in storybooks and in play helps children prepare for adulthood and how to deal with emotional crisis, how to deal with difficult situations, things that you can say, problem solving, plans that you can establish, attempts that you can make. You learn from the errors, etc., and you retry another episode. So we see the child who has experienced something when they went to the doctor, or they experienced something through book reading, and then they become the doctor. They have the same, they try to emulate that same emotional response and the kind of problem-solving response that they saw the adults doing. The stories help us build a foundation for cultural and social interactions. So the child watches mommy and how she interacts with the baby and the things that she does. So baby cries, and that's a problem. Mommy feeds the baby. That's trying an attempt, planning to feed the baby in her attempt, etc. She talks to the baby, and then the baby is contented. So the child imitates those same kinds of behaviors. Here we have dad and the little boy talking about cars and hot cars and what's cool about them and how fast they go, etc. So you learn your attitudes and your emotional response to things by engaging in narratives with others. And here's little guys who are doing much more complex narratives with this castle set. And so this is like talking to the baby doll, and this is talking for the knights or the other characters. So we actually put words in the mouths of plastic figures. And you say things like, I'm going to lower the drawbridge. Well, I'm going to raise the ladder. So children learn that, they can, that theory of mind, that they can impart emotions and concepts into their characters. Okay. Um, Oral and written narratives use words to engage children in actions and emotions. So we've got some written narratives here that start with, learning about things that are different from your own experience. We've got the boy who cried wolf, and so basically, what what it's like to first tell a lie, and then when you're not believed, how you emotionally respond to that. Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, so how you emotionally respond to having a younger brother. And the books and the experiences that the children have as they get older increasingly distance their own experiences in time and space and emotion. So Charlotte's Web, now you're imparting emotions into a spider, and you have to understand how the spider might feel and why the spider might feel that way. Huckleberry Finn and how his attitude is different from most kids' attitudes. Lost in Space or Traveling to Mars, something that's nobody's really experienced, and so you would have to get into the fantasy world in order to understand the characters and their actions, or seeing something on the other side of the world, or a sea monster. So, narrative language is important for socialization and self concept. 70% of the narratives produced by children are personal narratives. When you're talking about your own experiences and recounting these daily experiences, how something was broken, who was mean at school, or a personal achievement. All of that requires narrative structure, and all of that helps to develop that personal, social, emotional development. Children who are good storytellers engage in more language practice. So just because you're telling stories, you're getting more practice with language and how to express your ideas more completely and in a more exciting way. So they receive more attention from their peers and greater attention and approval from adults. So it's, again, an important medium for developing personality and self-concept. It's also important for making that transition from oral language into written language. So in oral language, you tell stories like, well, I was playing with my friends when something happened, and then later you take that same experience and you recognize it as you're reading. Zach, who was playing with his friends, so the use of oral language transitions into the use of the same type of language and talk into written language, and it guides the reader to expect similar meaning and structure when they actually start to read written words. All right, so if we have poor narrative development, then it's pretty predictable that we're going to have more difficulty interpreting experiences, difficulty with play, daily routines, learning and retaining information such as history, more difficulty with social interactions with adults and peers. You can't follow their stories, you can't communicate clear stories to them, difficulty organizing and planning your schedules, your chores, your assignments. So again, the children are not going to get their homework done on time, or it's not going to be complete. They're not planning and organizing that temporal, causal, planful sequence that narrative thinking helps us do. Recounting experiences, understanding and following rules and procedures. Lots of difficulty with reading comprehension, as we'll explore. And as we've shown, it's such an emotionally laden type of experience. If you can't use narratives, there's difficulty with self-concept and then self-regulation of your behavior. So, narrative shouldn't just be one of those extra skills taught, but it really should be an integral part of all intervention activities. We need to see it as a foundational building block for cognitive and emotional development, and recognize that without narrative, development will be limited. We also need to recognize that we have to be at the right level of narrative in order for the child to learn from narrative. So narrative can be as simple as a little, episode, or it can be as complex as Gone with the Wind. So narrative should be the focus of the interventions for this continuum from birth through adult language disorders. So when we talk about, this narrative continuum, it ranges from infants who are just starting to, for example, look at books, or in oral narratives, just learning how to coo back and forth between a parent and maintain that sequence of interaction patterns. A little bit older, the child starts to understand that the pictures are telling stories, and they start to understand the narratives according to the sequence of pictures, as well as in oral language, where you start to tell your child little stories and the child starts to recount stories. As you get a little older, then basically the child is reading books without any pictures. So now the narrative is becoming a word-based narrative, just as oral stories are word-based. And then finally, as adults, we have long, complex, convoluted stories that we read, and we might tell each other long recountings of events. So if we're going to use books, for example, as a medium for narrative development, which I love, that visual input gives the children something that you can establish joint focus. You can talk about it in a lot of detail and help the children process a lot of information in the narrative, including the emotional responses, the causal responses, the circumstances, and the details. So if we're going to use that, it's important to be at the right developmental level. So how do we get there? We introduced the SDS model a little bit in the last module where we were talking about contextualizing and decontextualizing information for children who are having difficulty learning something. So we're going to discuss that SDS model further with the situational, discourse, and semantic levels. So these three dimensions of language, the situation, if you remember, is what the language is representing. So are we talking about pictures in front of us? Are we talking about real objects in front of us? Are we talking about symbolic objects like toys in front of us? Are we talking about words that we're listening to? Are we talking about words that we're reading? What exactly is the language representing? So what are we presenting as our therapy material? A book with written language in it, a picture book, play materials, or are we just conversing? The next level is the discourse, and today we're focusing on narrative. Next time we'll focus on expository. But narrative, how is the information organized? And there are many different types of narrative organization and levels of narrative organization. And then the semantic context, or what is it that we're actually saying? So are we just labeling things, or are we describing things in great detail? Are we drawing a lot of inferences or using a lot of metaphors? So exactly how are we communicating our narrative? So it's like, what are the materials? How organized is it? And then what kind of talk are we doing? So this is a block or a cube that tries to represent that continuum of situational, the continuum of discourse, and the continuum of semantic or meaningful ideas that we're saying about our materials and organizing it in terms of narrative structure. So this is just a quick run through of development. In the situational context, the book is an object, so the child just flips the pages and may hit or chew on the book. And then the parent always treats the book as special and says, no, no, let's look at the picture. There's ducky, quack, quack. There's puppy, woof, woof. So parents treat the book differently than any of the other toys. So the book becomes an object, and we try to look at those symbols that are supposed to be representing something meaningful for the child. At the next level, the child recognizes the books, the pictures in the books, and may start to make some comments like woof, woof, woof. So they're looking at isolated pictures, but now they're understanding that this picture represents something real. At the next level, the child starts to see action. So this is not just a dog and a cat. This becomes a dog chasing the cat. This becomes a dog that got away from the boy. So now you're seeing the action in these little two-dimensional pictures that don't have any action. You have to symbolize the action. So a story sequence, if we look at our storyboard, we start to see a temporal sequence starting to form. We see that the child starts to name the action instead of just the nouns, and they start to recount the dialogue. So if it's something like, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down, basically they remember that dialogue and they put it in the appropriate place in the story. The next level, the child starts to pay attention to plot-related events. So they see the picture and they remember that the dog, was mean, so they start talking about the mean dog. So they're seeing cause-effect relationships. It's not just that the dog is chasing the cat, but the dog is chasing the cat because the boy let him go, or the dog is chasing the cat because he wants to play. So you start to see that causality. And the child, again, this is about 3.5, and the child starts to tell bits and pieces of the story. Then the child starts to follow actions across the pages, and they start to see the problems and the outcomes of the problems. So they start to ask questions, tell about the page, make predictions about what's going to happen next. Especially if it's a familiar storybook that's been read several times, then the the child starts to be able to talk more about the things that are happening in the story. By late threes, the child is starting to learn more from books. So even if they've never visited the desert, they can look at a book and they can start to learn about the desert or learn about outer space. The stories get more complex, and so they have the plan, the attempt to solve the problem. You have the problem, the plan, and the attempt to solve the problem, as well as the outcome. So we're seeing the problem, the plan, the attempt, and the outcome. And they start to not only recognize the physical causality, but also the psychological causality. So when we look up here, it's like, the dog was lonely, and so that's his psychological causality. So he sees the cat, he tries to make friends with the cat. Again, we're into the psychology of it. But the cat runs away, and so the dog chases after her to play with her. So we're talking about not only the physical causality, the cat got, scared, ran away. Well, the cat ran away is the physical causality, but the cat got scared is the psychological reality that caused the cat to run away. So basically, the child is able to handle all of those different levels. Um, then we have more and more unexperienced and fantasy events like the sea monster or the trip to Mars. More evaluations. He shouldn't have let go of the dog because the dog could hurt the cat. So you start to evaluate what you've learned from Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You learn to either lock your house or you learn not to touch other people's property. So the sort of values and evaluations start to come out in stories. Then you start paying more attention to the words, and the words tend to have more principles or lessons. So Bernstein Bears start teaching you about, don't be greedy, or they start teaching you about don't tell lies, or they start teaching you about don't eat junk food. So the children start to learn more of these psychological kinds of things, and the words become increasingly more important. So the child starts to recognize that the words are to be read. They pay more attention to the letters and the words rather than the pictures. So the stories start to become multiply episode stories. So if you read a Bernstein Bear story, it's not just one single story. There are many episodes within the story. And the children start to ask higher level questions, like inferential questions, and a lot of why questions. Why did he do that? When is he coming back, etc. They also do this verbatim reading where, even though they're not yet a reader, they pretend that they're reading, especially, again, a story that's been repeatedly read to them. So they sort of take on that role of a reader before they fully understand the reading process. Then you basically have more stories that get into other characters' feelings and experiences, and that empathy. You have stories now with parallel episodes, so you have a protagonist and an antagonist. So children, at 4.5 start to love things like 101 Dalmatians, where you have to understand Cruella de Vil's motivations. So she wants a dog coat, and her plan is to capture the puppies and turn them into a coat. And then you've got the dog's motivation to save the puppies, and so their plot lines keep crossing each other. So Cruella gets close to being able to capture the puppies, but then the dogs come in and save the puppies, and then Cruella tries to do something else, and the puppies figure out another way to escape. So everybody's plot line keeps crossing over as you have these different needs and different goals, and only one person can win in the end. So there's more of a focus on letters and words and print, so that there's a lot of talk at this stage about learning to read, and talking about the letters and the sounds, etc., as children start to move into that being a reader. And then finally, by the time you're out of second grade reader, there's very few illustrations, and the words pretty much are telling the stories, and the plot lines are very interactive and complex. So you basically no longer, after about third grade, you're no longer learning to read, but you're reading to learn. Okay, this is just a short little videotape that looks at levels of storybook reading. And It just shows trying to figure out the appropriate level that as we just went through, the appropriate level of reading. And you can see when the child disengages because we're at a too high a level. And then as you keep moving the play, or the storybook reading down, you see.
The frog's sitting in the water. Mm-hmm. Ribbit, 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 ribbit. Two frogs. Ribbit. And look, a little bitty mouse. A little bitty mouse is sitting on the tub. What do you see? What do you see? What do you see? What do you see? Where's the frog? Picture doesn't make any sense to you. Let's try another one. Be careful, be careful. Clifford fell in the bowl. Look. Clifford the puppy fell in the bowl. Oh, Clifford, be careful. You're falling in the bowl. And here's Emily Elizabeth. She says, be careful, Clifford. Don't fall in the bowl. Be careful, Clifford. Don't fall in the bowl. Here comes Clifford. He's climbing in. Mm-hmm. Right. Look. Okay. Mm-hmm. This way. Here, sweetie. Uh-oh. Can you brush Clifford's teeth? Oh, now his teeth are clean. Let's find Critter. I think Critter had big teeth. Look at his teeth. Can you brush his teeth? Oh, get your teeth clean. Get your teeth clean. That's right. His teeth are dirty, dirty, dirty. Get him to brush his teeth. Brush your teeth. Brush your teeth. Look. Brush your teeth. Brush your teeth. And look at his hair. Needs some soap because he's all dirty. Let's get the soap out. There's the soap. You're all dirty. You're all dirty. You made a mess. You made a mess. You're all dirty. You're all dirty. You made a mess.
You're all dirty.
You're all dirty. You made a mess.
The child more able to engage. And if you didn't look at the previous module 2, or you want to look at it again, there are several examples, videos, tapes, examples of working with preschoolers on narrative. So, just briefly looking at the levels of organization, these are the contextualized levels, so these would be looking at books that have pictures. So at the bottom level, it's discrete. That's, the young child that basically says they're a kitty and then puts the book down and leaves. So there's not much narrative structure that the child is able to display. Then the child starts to go through sort of a collection. So you might look at this picture and you just might say, well, there's a tree and the sun is yellow and the roof is green and I see 2 windows. So it's just a collection. There isn't any theme going on, but the child stays a little bit longer asking questions about what's this, what's this, what's this. A lot of that sort of questioning without any real plot line going. Then you have the descriptive list type of story where the first page shows the pig. So it says, the pig says oink, and then the next page the dog says woof, the next page the duck says quack, the next page the bear says grr, etc. So basically each page is the same kind of format, but they're arranged around a topic of animals and what they say, and each page tells a different animal or profiles a different animal and their sound. So those books are real popular with the 2-year-old set. We start moving into temporal sequences in stories. So the boy climbed up a hill, the boy rolled down the hill, the boy looked up at the sky, and then he saw a face in the clouds. So it's doesn't necessarily have to happen this way. The boy could have looked up at the sky and saw the clouds and then climbed up a hill and then rolled down the hill. It's just that's the temporal sequence that the story happened to take on. So it's this we start to see some temporal sequencing. Then stories get more complex when you see some actual causality. The boy lifted a weight, the weight was too heavy, the boy dropped the weight. These sentences we can't rearrange. We can't say the boy dropped the weight, the boy lifted a weight. He has to lift it in order to drop it. So basically, in the causality of the weight was too heavy doesn't occur until he tried to lift it. And when it was too heavy, it caused him to drop it. So these can be, rearranged. These cannot. These have this um, sequence, but also causality between the different events in the story. Then we have the decontextualized levels. So the decontextualized levels, as you recall, are when there is no picture to support the talk. So this is when we tell oral stories to each other, and they're usually about past events. And so those past things are no longer visually present to us. The monkey wanted the banana on the banana tree. He moved a box under the tree, and he climbed up and he grabbed it. So another unique thing about this one is that there's more plan or purpose. So basically, the monkey didn't just happen to find a box. He actually moved the box on purpose. So there's a plan to his actual story, and he climbed up and he grabbed it. A complete story is going to have all of the things that the other stories have. So it will have time, it will have causality, it will have psychological causality, it will have a plan or a purpose, but it's also going to have an evaluation. The girl wanted a new dress, so there's her psychological causality. She went to the bank and took all of her money out, so that's her plan, and then she spent it on her dress, so that's her attempt. Now she has no money for food. That was foolish, she said, so now she's evaluating. So there was a consequence to not saving some of her money. Okay, so this is a complete narrative. Now, a lot of stories might have just one complete narrative, but usually when we're getting into these higher level stories, you're going to have multiple episodes. So we have things that are now compound episodes where it has two or more of these kinds of episodes. So this would be like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. First you have the Goldilocks eats the porridge episode. Then we have the Goldilocks selects a chair episode. Then we have the Goldilocks sleeps in the beds episode. And then we have the Goldilocks escapes when the bears come home episode. So each thing has a complete once upon a time. There are three bears. Goldilocks came to the house. Her problem was she was hungry. So her first plan was to eat the Papa Bear's porridge, but it was too hot. So her next plan was to eat the Mama Bear's. It was too hot, etc., etc. So this episode comes to an end before the next one begins. The complex one is the Cruella de Vil, as we talked about, and then interactive is a very complex story, like Gone with the Wind, where it takes place over a long period of time. There are flashbacks, there are forwards, there are overlapping plot lines. Things that happen in one part of the country affect what happens somewhere else. And so, and it goes on for 400 pages. And so basically it's very interactive with all these multiple woven topics. And in order to comprehend that, you have to be able to follow all of that complexity. Okay. So level 5, as we just talked about, is the place where we can say there's a complete episode, which is going to be a time, characters, a place, a problem, a plan, an emotional response to that, and a plan to solve it, the attempt that you actually make, and then the outcome. Was it a positive outcome or a negative outcome? If it's a negative outcome, you might still have the problem and have to use, try another strategy or another plan. So the porridge was too hot, so you had to go back and try again and try the mama bears, but it was too cold, and then finally it was a positive outcome. The baby bear's porridge was just right, and so that episode ends. And you have your evaluation. All right, so let's just try practicing applying this to the Three Little Pigs for a moment. So our time. Okay, so one day, characters, Three Little Pigs and their mom. Setting, we're in Mama's house in the kitchen. Problem, they were growing up and they needed to find their own houses. And so their plan, they're each drawing their own plans on how they're going to build their houses. And then we have the attempt, the pig that did the straw house, the stick house, and the brick house. Then we go a couple of episodes later and we see that the pig has made his house, but now the time, a week later. The character of the pig and the wolf. The setting at the straw house. The problem, the wolf wants to come in and eat the pig. The plan, the pig is going to, the wolf is going to huff and puff and blow the house down if the pig won't come out. And then we see our attempt. He blew it as hard as he could, and the outcome was both happy and sad. He blew the pig's house down, but the pig got away. So I guess it's sad for the wolf, but happy for the pig. And then the evaluation at the end of the story is he should have made a stronger house. All right, so now we're going to watch a videotape at the emergent reading level. So the emergent reading level is going to be the symbolic level because we have a picture that depicts the plot of the story or this episode, and then we have the actual text that goes along with that episode. So this is going to say, lamb needed a mother, so he went to the bull, 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 will you be my mother? So we basically have a pretty close relationship. It's called a near relationship between what's written in the text and what's seen in the picture. So that makes it very contextualized. The words are contextualized to the picture and they give about the same information. Okay, so if we want to look at the story grammar of this, the time is next, after he left a previous animal. Next, the lamb went to the bull. The lamb crawled through the hole in the hedge, right here. So that's our location. The lamb needs a mother is the problem. So he needs to find another animal to be his mother since the duck before this page couldn't be his mother. So his attempt is to say, bull, will you be my mother? But it's a sad outcome. Bull said, I can't be your mother, I'm a bull. So, in this little intervention that we're going to watch, you're going to see the use of language to interpret the pictures. So we're going to, teach vocabulary. We're going to teach, how to interpret the picture, how to draw inferences, how to, how to talk about the things that are in the picture. And then we are also going to use the written words, and we're going to interpret the language of the written words. What kind of an animal is that?
See what he has through his nose? Do any of you guys know?
It's not a cow, it's a...
Samantha?
Pig.
No.
Bull.
It's a bull.
Bull. Are bulls girls or boys?
Boy.
That's the boy cow is the bull. Look how big and strong he is. How did the lamb get in there? Looks like there's a big hedge all around to keep him in there, but what did the lamb find?
What's this?
Lamb.
The lamb crawled through it looks like a hole in that big bush. The bush is like a fence that's keeping that big bull away from all the other animals because he's a little bit dangerous. But is lamb scared? Does she look scared? No. She crawled through the hole. And what is she going to ask him, do you think? You think maybe he wants the bull to try to be his mother? Let's read and find out.
Okay.
Bull, will you be my mother?
Oh, will you be my mother?
I am a bull, said the bull.
And he probably said it like a big man, so we'll have Roman read it for us.
I'm a bull.
I think that's a hog.
It's a bull. He just said, I am a bull.
I think it's a hog.
Oh, maybe he's confused.
I can be your mother.
All right, Roman will do it again for us.
So I am a bull. I can't be your mother.
Oh, the bull does not want to even try to be the poor little lamb's mother. He says, I'm a bull. I can't be your mother.
That's the lamb.
Exactly. Exactly.
Would you be scared if you met a bull?
No.
You're
With those big
pretty.
horns, bulls are kind of dangerous, you guys.
Actually, I'm tough.
You're tough.
You are tough.
If that bull comes near us, I'm gonna rip him to pieces.
Oh. So now what is baby lamb going to do?
He's going to get
He is going to cry and look for another.
mother.
He has to go somewhere else to look for a mother.
He first found a horse and then he found a bull. What could he find next? Maybe a pig. Maybe a cow. A female bull.
At a slightly higher level, we're going to use communicative reading strategies with language-based poor comprehension, children with language-based poor comprehension. So you'll see that these kids are really going to struggle. So these are second graders reading this story. They're really going to struggle with trying to figure out what those words mean and how to comprehend those words. This one is going to also be contextualized because we do have pictures, but there is a more distanced relationship between the pictures and the words. So he says, but I don't care, Stanley. So it's not just talking about like the boy saw the cat and said, cat, will you be my friend? He's saying, but I don't care. So we have to know what he means by I don't care. Stanley is not the cat. Stanley is somebody on the other side of the fence. I don't want to play with you. I don't want to talk to you. So we don't see play going on, and you can see us talking. So basically there's more, this sets the stage or the setting, but it doesn't communicate as much of the information as the other picture did. We look at the story structure today. The boy looked for Stanley in the backyard. Stanley's on the other side of the fence. The problem is Stanley won't answer him. So his plan is to make his activities sound so exciting that Stanley will want to play with him. And then when that doesn't work, then he uses this reverse psychology. Well, I don't want to play with you, and I don't want to talk to you. But really what the child means is, I do want to play with you, but you're not talking to me, so I'll just pretend that I don't want to play with you. So again, the language relationship, in order to understand and comprehend the story, the language relationship is much more complex and takes much more inferential thought, understanding reverse psychology. And Stanley still won't play as the outcome. So let's watch this video for a few minutes and watch the strategies that are used to try to help the children comprehend So cover up the first one and tell me what that little half a word says. Stan.
And
So read this title for us one more time.
and I mean it. And
Stan.
Lee.
Okay, so his name is Stanley. And he said, and I mean it, Stanley. Do you ever say, and I mean it? Or did your mommy ever say, I mean it?
No, not really.
Clean up that room, and I mean it. Okay. So if somebody is serious about something, they mean it.
Listen,
Listen.
Stanley. I know you are there.
So look at the picture. He's peeking under,
One gate.
he's peeking under a fence or under a gate. And he seems to be talking to somebody. And what does he tell them?
Stanley. Wait.
He says,
Let's listen, Stanley.
listen, Stanley, I know you're there. Listen, Stanley, I know you are there. And we were just talking about how he's peeking under the fence. So do we know who Stanley is? Do we? Who's Stanley?
Little boy.
No. He's saying, listen, Stanley. There should be Stanley on the other side of the fence. And he says, I know you are there.
This is the other side of the fence.
No, that's his side of the fence.
Really?
On his side of the fence, we have all this barrel and all of these jugs and this bucket and this kitty cat. All of these things are on his side of the fence. And he's looking under the fence to try to find Stanley. And he doesn't see Stanley, but he says, listen, Stanley, I know you are there.
I think Stanley's like an animal or something.
You think maybe Stanley's an animal? That could be.
I know you are there in back of the fence.
I know you are in back of the fence. Okay, you may as well come out because I know you are in back of the fence.
I don't want to play with you. I don't want to think it
Talk. What does that say?
talk to you.
So let's talk about it for a minute. He said, but I don't care, Stanley. I don't care that you're behind the fence. I don't want to play with you and I don't want to talk to you. Do you think that's true?
No.
What do you think is true? Stanley's not talking to him, so he's acting like, oh, I don't want to talk to you either. But he's not telling the truth. He really does want to have somebody to play with.
I am having a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
But look at his face. Does he look like he's having that much fun? Why not?
Because
What?
Stanley isn't there.
Stanley isn't there. He misses his best friend. Or the root word. Who do you see together at the end of the word?
U-E.
Uh-huh. And how many vowels is that?
2.
What's the rule for 2 vowels?
Has to be grown up in the middle.
Okay, and which grown up?
U.
Okay, so put her there. There you go. So now what's the word sound out?
Tur-U.
Huh?
Tur-U.
You're telling me tur, but that's not true. It's not the Erlene sound. It's just Arlene's R sound. R,
Cr-
U,
True.
tur,
True.
true. There you go. Now, what I'm going to do is add an ly to it. And when I add an ly to it, I drop the e and add the ly.
Truly.
Truly.
Get.
So he says, read it with me. I
am making a great thing. Stinging a really truly great thing.
a really, truly great thing. So it's absolutely true. It's really and truly a great thing.
And when and when it is done, you will want to see it. Stanley.
And what does it mean, and when it is done? What word could I put instead of it? We have to go back to the page before. A really, truly great thing. Okay? It is this really, truly great thing that he's making. And on the next page, he calls it, instead of calling it, and when my really, truly great thing is done, he only calls it
It.
but it still means his really, truly great thing. So tell me that idea again. And
And when it is done, you will want to see it. Stanley.
right, you're going to want to see this thing that I made. It's so cool. And now what is he telling Stanley?
Well, you can't. I don't want you to, and I mean it, Stanley.
When he says, I don't want you to do what? I don't want you to. If you were going to finish the sentence, how would you finish it? I don't want you to. You have to look on the page before. I don't want you to. Find any words in the sentence that tells you what he does?
See.
What?
See.
I don't want you to see it. Well, you can't see it.
I don't want you to see it. And I mean it, Stanley.
The difficulty encountered in this level of a book. And then finally, we see the older students. Now, older students tend to be better readers in terms of word decoders, but their comprehension stays very low. So if you're struggling with the language of a reading book and comprehension, you're going to get stuck at about a fourth grade level. So when I'm working with kids in my program, if the child's a fourth grader, we would work at this level. If the child's a ninth grader, we would work with the same book. So basically, they're all going to get stuck with the complexities of the language. This one we're just going to talk through for a moment and start to look at what's so hard about this language. 10-year-old Sammy Westberg poked his older brother Bill on the arm. He whispered, "When is the sunrise breakfast going to start? I'm starving, and my legs are falling off." His whisper shot through the nearly dark museum. The crowd of people around him frowned. Well, let's start looking at this and the kinds of language difficulties poor comprehenders are going to have. We don't have any picture at all, so this is now decontextualized. So we have to talk without the benefit of any visual support, and we have to use the word symbols in order to create visual images in our head so we can comprehend and understand the story. So instead of going from pictures to words, or at least overlapping, now we have to go from words to pictures or images in our own thinking. So the character, 10-year-old Sammy Westberg poked his older brother Bill on the arm. So we see two of our characters, Sammy and his brother Bill. So we're going to introduce the characters by having the child read the sentence. Use the storyboard to mark the narrative structure. Comment to model comprehension strategies you use when you read, like associating ideas from your own experience to draw inferences. So for example, the child reads this and you might say, "That's annoying when your little brother pokes your arm." About how old do you think Bill is? We know Sammy's 10. About how old do you think Bill might be? That sends them back to look at the text again to find out that Bill's older, and Sammy's 10, and to take a moment, we call it, self-regulation type of thing. Good readers and good comprehenders reflect back on something that they've read for a second so that they can make those kinds of connections. So through this communicative reading, we're basically helping the kids do that self-regulation. Okay, so he's probably feeling annoyed, and he's probably a little bit older than Sammy. The time. He whispered, "When is the sunrise breakfast going to start? I'm starving." So this situates the action in a time frame, so it doesn't actually say anything about an actual time. So again, we have to get the kids to use that self-regulation to reflect back on this information to get the impression of what time it's happening. So we might say something like, "So they seem to be waiting for maybe breakfast, and breakfast is at what time?" And they look and they see sunrise. Sunrise? Well, how early is sunrise? And then they give you their idea of what time sunrise is. So if they're waiting for sunrise, what time must it be? Well, how would you feel if it was that early? So again, we're getting into that emotional response. Why is Sammy acting the way that he is? And so relating it to their own experience and how they feel that early in the morning helps them impart that emotional reaction of Sammy over here. Okay, then we have the setting. "And my legs are falling off." His whisper shot through the nearly dark museum. The crowd of people around him frowned. So now we're getting the knowledge that there's a bunch of people and they're all in this museum. You also have to help the kids understand the figurative language. My legs are falling off. His whisper shot through the nearly dark museum. So you might say things like, "Well, where are they? And who are they with? Why do they all seem to be so mad at Sammy? How can a whisper be a shot? Or how can a whisper be shot? Are his legs really falling off?" So I'm always surprised sometimes by the answers I get from these older kids. And then you just have to sit there and explain and act it out and do whatever you need so they start to understand how this language is being used to communicate the idea that everybody else is being quiet, but Sammy is being loud and obnoxious. Bill frowned at him too, so Sammy hit him. Then he ran behind a stone post. So we're starting to see that Sammy's behavior is getting to be a real problem. So a lot of things might need to be discussed, like where's this stone post coming from? Or why would you have a stone post in a museum, etc. So you identify the problem of the episode and you start talking about some of those things that the child might not be turning into imagery. I wonder why Sammy hit Bill for frowning. That's all he did was frown. Why did he hit him? Why did he run behind a stone post? Well, how big must that post be? Why do you think Sammy is misbehaving? He's poking, he's complaining, he's whispering too loud, and he's running in the museum. Why is he doing that? So again, asking the kids to draw inferences and use their own experience to try to interpret the behaviors of Sammy. We introduce more characters in the next sentence. The other three Woodlanders, Kathy, Dave Briggs, and Mrs. Tandy, were right next to the boys. So again, we have to understand who the Woodlanders are, that they're sort of a family group, although they're not related to each other. They do everything together, and Mrs. Tandy is their fearless leader. So you have to make that association. Other family members are with Sammy, find out who they are. And then finally, more of the problem is discussed, or the problem is discussed more completely. Mrs. Tandy looked at her watch and she whispered softly, "We left Bluff Lake at 4 this morning. Now it's 5:30. No wonder Sammy's in a bad mood." So again, the emotional response. She's not mad at Sammy. She's feeling empathy for Sammy, and that dictates how she actually behaves. So conversation might be something like, "So is Mrs. Tandy mad at Sammy? Well, why not? Why aren't people mad at her for whispering? They got mad at him for whispering, but they're not mad at her for whispering. Why not?" And then what could she do to help Sammy? Now, we're not reading very much information. This takes a long time, and the point is not to get it read. The point is to use the language of the written text to teach how to unpack language, how to use your prior knowledge to interpret and infer information that goes beyond the literal meaning of the words. Usually the kids are going to be reading with poor intonation. They're going to be reading with the wrong phrasing. They're going to be, doing a lot of those kinds of miscues that help you recognize when they're having difficulty comprehending the information. As we continue, in addition to the narrative parts of it, we also need to be talking about some of the language structures, so some of the syntactic structures and other things that confuse kids and contribute to poor comprehension. So, for example, 14-year-old Bill whispered, "We all sort of are." And it's like, well, who's we all? It's a cohesive tie. Language delayed kids as preschoolers had difficulty just understanding the gender of pronouns, so we had to work on he versus she versus they. Now we see those pronouns, but they're used in these complex narratives and they're used cohesively. So basically, they refer to information found in previous sentences. So, for example, we all sort of are. So I would take my finger and I would go back to the previous page and I'd say we all are. So the Woodlanders, Kathy is, Dave Briggs is, Mrs. Tandy is, Sammy is, Bill is. We all are. The word "are" is also a cohesive tie. It's called ellipsis when you don't include all of the information in the sentence because it's redundant with information already known. But again, children with language delays have a lot of difficulty filling in those gaps and understanding that this sentence relates to previous sentences. They read each sentence as if it's something separate and they don't really put the information together cohesively. So we're going to have to, again, help the child understand that. "Are" means, and you're pointing back and forth between "are" and "in a bad mood," information in another sentence. So if we look back at our other sentence, then it's we all are in a bad mood. So we are in a bad mood, we all are. So you model the whole sentence. We all are in a bad mood. And then you model it with the intonation the way it was written. We all are. And Sammy King of Pest isn't helping any. Here's another example. When we look at the sentence, they were all waiting. So there's our noun phrase, our were waiting is our verb phrase, which is interrupted with this all. Then we have for the museum's visitors, which is a prepositional phrase, from New Zealand. And this looks like another prepositional phrase, to someplace. But it's not, because what we end up here with here is another verb. So we have waiting as the main verb of our sentence, but we also have another verb. We were doing the waiting. The visitors were supposed to show up. And so this is an infinitive to. So it's a linguistic grammatical form that allows us to put another verb in the sentence. So, and also show up. Up looks like another preposition, but that's a particle. That's part of the verb, show up, dress up. Kinds of things that look like prepositions, but they're really part of the verb. So again, my explanation with the kids might be, well, there's two things happening in this sentence. The family is waiting, and the visitors are going to show up. So the word to lets me put more action in my sentence. I can put the action of the visitors and the action of the woodlanders and the people in the museum. Okay, another example. Got the word suddenly here. Well, in a basic sentence, remember it starts with a noun phrase like they, then you have your verb phrase, heard, and then we have our object, the sound of drums, and then we would have an adverb like suddenly. They heard the sound of drums suddenly. But the author can move that adverb from the end of the sentence to the beginning of the sentence for emphasis. So if you wanted to talk about how startling it is, because it happened so suddenly, then you would put the suddenly at the beginning of the sentence. So that's the kinds of things that I would talk to the kids about. Point to suddenly. This tells you when they heard the sound. Suddenly they heard the sound. I could say they heard the sound suddenly if I wanted to, or I can move that suddenly to the beginning of the sentence. Okay, another example of complexity. Then he said, somebody's coming out from behind the stuffed elephants, a Maori woman from New Zealand. He said the word like this, Maori, a little like flowery. A couple of modules ago, we talked about the use of phonic faces for making that phonetic to phonic connection. So this is an example when you could pull out the phonic faces and help the kids see, visually see the patterns of phonology. Here's another problem. There are two verbs in this sentence, so we've got 16-year-old Dave said, no, I bet she's an American Indian. This was going to be a really tough sentence for the kids. I bet is the first verb, and then she is, so this is another verb, an American Indian. So remember, when we have two verbs, that means we really have two sentences, and they have to be put together with something like a conjunction or a relative pronoun, but I don't see any conjunctions or relative pronouns in this particular sentence. So this is going to throw off the kids. I bet, and then they're expecting an object of the verb, she, but then the S apostrophe S doesn't make any sense. She, American Indian. So what we really have here is a relative pronoun that's been elided from the sentence. So the real sentence is going to be, it tells you what Dave bets. I bet that she's an American Indian. So I can say, I bet that she's an American Indian, because that word lets me put those two ideas together. Or I can take it out. I bet she's an American Indian. The following sentence is very much the same structure. I read that some of them would be meeting the Maoris. But this time the relative pronoun is actually there in the surface of the sentence. But it doesn't have to be. I read some of them would be meeting the Maoris. So again, you can compare these two sentences when the that has been elided and when the that is actually present. But it's the same sentence structure. Now the point is that when we're teaching this to kids in written text and when we're making aware of them, of these things. These are common kinds of language transformations that you're going to read about in every single book, the third grade level and above. You're going to have these things very often in a first and second grade book. But anyway, there's going to be these things over and over and over. Well, these kids have never learned those patterns. They don't know how to recognize them. They lose the meaning. You can hear it in their intonation when you ask them a comprehension question. They don't know how to comprehend the information. They get it wrong. So basically, you're teaching them the patterns and how your brain has to unpack this complex language and find the patterns. We're teaching them to sit back and reflect on the text until it makes sense. And once they start doing this, then basically, once the patterns are theirs, then they start automatically using the patterns. So it's not unusual for me in 12 hours of working with these older kids. I see them 6 times during the summer for 2 hours. And it's not at all unusual to go anywhere from 4 to 6 grade levels improvement in reading and reading comprehension, because I don't work on reading. I work on these language issues that are preventing the children from interpreting the text and making sense of the text. Once their brain starts to find these patterns, because we keep stopping and talking about them, once they start to see those patterns, then basically they start to read that way and then they comprehend better as they go. This one, I read that some of them would be meeting the Maoris here. This is another cohesive tie. Okay, so some of them would be meeting the Maoris here at the museum. Well, the them points back to the American Indians. Our first settlers goes back to the American Indians, and New Zealand's goes back up to the Maori people. So again, that confusing cohesion if you don't know how to interpret cohesive ties. Okay. We can also use narrative interventions for writing. This is a real beginning one. So instead of asking kids to start to write words and those kinds of things just on word lists, you can do the very same thing in the context of narrative. So you can be working on phonemic awareness and letter sound sequences and those kinds of things, but in the context of a narrative. So today is Friday, so this would be a worksheet that we might use with the kids. Today is Friday. It is a very hot day, so I want you to listen to the sounds and figure out how you would spell that word hot. What's the first sound? Hot. This is where I lay my phonic faces out on the table, so not all of them, but I'll lay, a choice of maybe 8 letters, and they have to look at those 8 letters and figure out which ones they might use for the word hot. Listen to the end of the word hot. Hot. Which letter makes my mouth make that sound? Now listen for the vowel. Here's 2 choices of vowels. Do you think you hear the maybe ah sound, or do you think you hear the ah sound? So, and the child writes what they hear. The sun is high in the sky, so we do the same thing. Okay, listen for the first sound, listen for the vowel, listen for the last sound. Sun is high in the sky, Sam is outside in the swimming pool. So again, just an example of how we can talk about what's happening in the story, and then we talk about how as writers we can write those words that go along with the information in the story. So it gives children this interesting narrative-based way of starting the writing process. Once kids start to be capable of doing some spelling, etc., then we move into these narrative writing activities. So the storyboard that we've been talking about all the way through, so we've got our time, our character, and our setting, we've got our problem, our plan, etc., now becomes this planning board. So this is the story planning board, and we're going to draw pictures in here, and then whatever picture is here gets written about here. So there's this close correspondence to the picture and the print, just like there are in the emerging storybooks. So basically, once you've got your picture, then you start writing about the time, the character, and the place. Once you've got your beginning action picture, then you start writing about that beginning action. So this is an example of a picture set. We've got this little squirrel in the first picture. So we start talking about him. All right, so who is our character? The squirrel. And when do you think this is? Maybe the morning. And what do you think he's doing? He's eating. What do you think he's eating? Maybe some nuts. How does he? How did he get that nut? It was on the ground. Okay. Then he had to crack the shell to get to the nut. So let's make sure that we, make our story interesting, our setting interesting, by giving some of those details. How old do you think our little our little squirrel is? Just a baby, just a couple weeks, a couple months old. I don't know how fast squirrels grow up. Anyway, so we, help the children to look at the picture and get some ideas of what they could say about their character. And then it's like, okay, now write about your setting. One morning, baby squirrel was outside. He found a delicious walnut on the ground. He cracked open the shell and began to eat the nut. Then we move on to the next part of the story. So we're teaching to write in story narrative form by organizing a picture narrative first and then turning it into a word narrative. So again, we're going to be looking at the emotional response and stuff. The curious dog, he sees the baby squirrel. They can impart that he, wants to play with it or whatever he wants. So Duke heard a noise in the backyard. He stuck his head through the gate to get a better look. It was a baby squirrel. Duke wanted to play with it. Pretty funny story, actually. So you see the dog playing with the baby, and of course the mother doesn't like that. And so she attacks him so that the baby can get away, and you see the baby running away during the attempt. And then the dog is so confused, has no idea what happened to him. All right. Now, at a slightly higher level, I might start out with, something like a vocabulary cartoon. These are great books for teaching vocabulary, but they're also fabulous pictures for helping children to understand the problems of stories. So they always depict something like this guy out on the desert island. So we put that in the problem. So we'll draw. I always tell kids it's stick figures. This is not art class. It's just quick drawing. So they basically will put the guy sitting on this desert island out in the middle of the ocean over here. Then they have to think backwards. So there aren't any pictures. They have to supply those pictures of how the guy got there, and then they have to come up with a plan to get him off of the island. So this one is going to, be at a higher level. There's some picture support, but you have to use mostly words in order to generate your story. So that's at that logical level. The discourse is guided by the actual story planner. So the discourse is supported, and then you have to come up with the ideas that you're going to put in there. So this is one of the child's drawings. So we've got this little guy who's out on I think he said that he was on a cruise and they stopped at the island and he went snorkeling. And while he was snorkeling, the cruise ship took off without him. And so he used that one tree that was on the island to build a raft, but as he was in the ocean, the raft started to break apart. He thought he was going to die, but then he finally made it to a beach. So again, it has a lot of plan and purpose in it. And you can see I typed it out, but this was his actual story that he wrote. He went on a cruise one summer. They stopped at an island, he got off the ship and tanned on the beach, etc. Okay, at an even higher level, so if you've got kids that don't need the pictures at all, then you can use story starters. The mail carrier delivered a strange package to the zoo. The cat woke up from a nap. She spied a paper bag. Or every morning Jacob talks to his birds. So you basically, have story starters that are ideas that kids can write about. They can use the story planning sheet to visualize the story, or they can just write it following the story grammar, etc. So after we go through a series of these that get progressively less and less supported by pictures, after several episodes of that narrative writing, kids get much better at narrative writing. So now we're up at this decontextualized level. So there aren't any pictures to support it. and the children have to use their own language system to symbolize in words what's happening in the story. So it's at a much higher level. All right, and then in terms of IEP goals, etc., we can use the Common Core standards. They're great in terms of giving us grade appropriate level ideas. So this is a kindergarten one with prompting and support, ask and answer questions, retell a familiar story, including key details, and with prompt and support, identify characters and setting and major events in the story, and ask about unknown words in the text. Actively engage in group reading activities, so one of those pragmatic goals, and then also a lot of the grammatical kinds of things or language things. Frequently occurring nouns and verbs, plurals, interrogative questions, prepositions, etc. So we can just write our IEP goals. When given a storyboard, the child will identify the character, setting, and major events of the story. Child will be able to attend to a group storybook discussion and answer, so that's this, and answer who, what, and where questions. So that's this. So we're basically taking, wherever it was, so we're taking information from across these objectives. Child will use vocabulary to label, describe, provide attributes, interpret pictures or actions, and make simple analogies corresponding to the pictures. And the child will use complete and complex sentences, which is down here, to include prepositions and conjunctions and relative clause constructions, which is the definition. So basically, we're using the Common Core to guide what we would put down as our language objectives. So it basically fits the reading model, but it also, for us, helps us to determine what kind of language foundation the children will need in order to succeed at that grade level. This is at the first grade level. We can see that there's now a higher level. The thing I like about the Common Core is the same skills. So now storytelling becomes retelling story with key details and understanding their central message or lesson. So now we're into that evaluation piece and describing the character, setting, and major events using key details. And then the grammar piece, again, starts to include higher level things. Now we can use any reading book to, basically teach this and measure it. So Pelican was hungry, he opened his bill wide and he closed it fast. That is how a pelican says, I'm hungry. Pelican looked down in the water. He saw something shaped like a fin in the water. Quick, he dove it down fast to eat it up. So when we look at the Common Core objectives, use common and proper and possessive nouns. So there's several examples. Use regular singular nouns with matching verbs, noun verb agreement. Use personal possessives. Use personal, possessive, and indefinite pronouns. So there's examples of different kinds of pronouns. Use verbs to convey a sense of past, present, and future. So there's a lot of verb tense. Use frequently occurring adjectives. So we've got hungry and big. We've got use frequently occurring conjunctions. So we've got so and. We use determiners like articles and demonstratives. And so that is a demonstrative, the is a determiner. Use frequently occurring prepositions. We've got lots of prepositions throughout the story. And produce and expand complete sentences. And so all of these are complete and expanded sentences. So basically, when we work on narratives, especially written narratives that give us opportunities to work on those things, we're working on all of these objectives that we would say are IEP objectives, that they would master these language forms that are appropriate for their grade level. We also can include a narrative goal because that's also on the standard. Retell stories including key details, demonstrate understanding of the central message, etc. And so we can pull out our storyboard as part of our lesson. One day, the pelican was sitting on a tree branch. He was hungry, opened his bill and closed it fast. I'm hungry, etc. Plan, he looked down the water, saw the thing. Attempt, he dove. And the consequence, but it was too big because it was a dolphin fin. And then you repeat the next episode until you conclude the story. So I hope this gives you some good ideas on not only how important narrative is, but how we can use reading and writing, not to teach reading and writing, but to teach the language that's the foundation of reading and writing so that we can improve comprehension and help children to prevent a lot of failure in school. And we'll see you next time.